Well, good evening, and a warm welcome to those of you who are with us here at Church of the Redeemer, and to those of you who are joining with us via the live stream. We gather to celebrate on the traditional lands of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. My name is Julie Meakin, and along with Jeff Nowers, I am one of the co-coordinators of the Bishops' Committee for Interfaith Ministry of the Anglican Diocese of Toronto. And on behalf of the committee, we are honored to have Raja Khouri and Jeffrey Wilkinson, who actually drove in from Guelph, with us this evening to speak about their book, The Wall Between: What Jews and Palestinians Don't Want to Know About Each Other. Hilary Ketchy, a committee member, will be introducing our speakers in a moment. But before that, I would like to ask Bishop Kevin Robertson to come and say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie, and may I extend a welcome and a greeting to those of you who are in the church tonight and those of you who are online. I think we have a number of people online today, and you are very much part of our community as those who are sitting in the church today. I bring greetings on behalf of the College of Bishops of the Diocese of Toronto, Bishop Andrew Asbill and Bishop Ursula Shaw. And it's my delight as the third bishop in the diocese to be the link with this work, with this Bishops' Committee on Interfaith Ministry. And we have a wonderful and gifted committee. Many of those members are here tonight, a mixture of clergy and lay people. We have robust conversations about what we can be doing as a diocese to build relationships with our siblings in other faith traditions across the diocese, not just here in the city of Toronto. Our diocese is a large one and extends through rural, suburban, and urban parts of this part of the province. So it's a great privilege to be a part of that work. I'm delighted that we have Raja and Jeffrey here tonight. Jeffrey was reminding me that the book was published, I think I knew this, just a couple of days before October 7th, 2023. And so we're so grateful that you're here to help us unpack a little bit about what life was, your intentions were before and also since. And I'm also mindful of the fact that not only was October 7th a very significant day, but the last 24 hours have been significant too. Not just for those who live south of the border, our friends and neighbors in the United States, but indeed has implications for the whole world, for those places that are at conflict, and for us here in Canada, neighbors to the north. And want to acknowledge that wherever you are right now, or however you may be feeling today and in the days and weeks ahead, I'm reminded that faith matters and that our faith traditions and our faith communities and the justice-seeking and truth-telling and the leadership that accompanies faith traditions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity among them is part of the leaven that is in the world. And anyway, I pray for courage and pray for a renewed sense of justice-seeking in our midst as our neighbors to the south grapple with the changes in their home. I've been asked to lead a prayer for tonight, and what I'd like to do is to offer a prayer from the Anglican Archbishop, Archbishop Hossam Naoum, who authored this prayer earlier this year. A prayer for peace. O God of all justice and peace, we cry out to you in the midst of the pain and trauma of violence and fear which prevails in the Holy Land. Be with those who need you in these days of suffering. We pray for people of all faiths, Jews, Muslims, and Christians, and for all people of the land. While we pray to you, O Lord, for an end of violence and the establishment of peace, we also call to you to bring justice and equality to the peoples. Guide us into your kingdom, where all people are treated with dignity and honor as your beloved children. For to all of us, you are our Heavenly Father. Amen.
Thank you, Bishop. So just the format for this evening. There will be an opportunity for us to ask questions. You might have already taken one of the index cards and a pencil from the front desk there. Just write your questions on the card. Maybe start thinking about them as the discussion is happening, and they will be collected maybe about 10 minutes before we have a break. We're planning to have a break around 8 o'clock. So we'll come around and collect those around 7:45 or 10 to 8. And Jeff will be moderating the Q&A as well. For those of you watching via live stream, please put your questions in the chat, and Jeff will do his best to get to as many of those as he can. Yes. And also the email address, yes. You can also send them to the email address, which is interfaith@toronto.anglican.ca. Yes. Okay. Great. We'd like to thank Church of the Redeemer for the use of this space. Special thanks go to Michael and Morgan. And there are 2 washrooms at the front of the church, and in case of an emergency, there are exit doors here on the sides of the church. There will be a book signing after the talk, as well as some refreshments. We would like to thank Bishop Kevin and the College of Bishops of the Diocese of Toronto for their support in enabling this event to happen. We are so pleased to be hosting this event, and we do so in the anticipation and the expectation that it will all be done with respect and goodwill. Finally, one of those things we always say is please silence your cell phones if you have a cell phone with you. And I will just turn it over to Hillary to introduce our speakers. Thanks.
Good evening. On behalf of the Bishops' Committee for Interfaith Ministry, it is my distinct privilege to welcome our speakers, Raja Khouri and Jeffrey Wilkinson. But before I share a little bit about our speakers, I wanted to share about how we came to this book and to this evening tonight. In the weeks and months following October 7th, we were struggling with what was happening in Israel and Gaza, and also how this was deeply impacting our interfaith relationships here in Canada. The deep hurt, the fear, the anger, the polarization and us versus them thinking. We wanted as a committee to do something that would be both helpful and meaningful, something that would help us understand the why and unpack a bit more, as Bishop Kevin said, what was happening, why it was happening, what's going on here, and maybe how we can navigate some of these challenging interfaith relationships. I had started the book, The Wall Between, and I shared it with the group. I felt like it was particularly relevant because the authors were living in Southern Ontario. They were writing for the diaspora. They knew our context, they understood our context, they were writing for our context. But more than that, what struck me about the book was that it was written by a Jew and a Palestinian together. Their relationship, their friendship, their commitment to focus on values rather than identity not only compelled me to read the book, but to really take what they were saying seriously. In an interview I listened to recently, Jeffrey described Raja as my brother, and that the power of their work is in fact their relationship. Raja Khouri is the CEO of Khouri Conversations, a human rights and inclusion consultant, the founding president of the Canadian Arab Institute, a board member at Rosanna Canada, which, if you don't know, is an organization that fosters cooperation between Israelis and Palestinians by providing access to healthcare. They're doing really incredible work. And he's also a former 10-year commissioner with the Ontario Human Rights Commission. He is a Canada Committee member of the Human Rights Watch and the co-founder of the Canadian Arab Jewish Leadership Dialogue Group. Jeffrey Wilkinson is an American Jew who lives in Canada, in Guelph. He holds a doctorate in education from U of T, just down the street, and he works actively in the Jewish community and beyond on issues relating to trauma and the Israel-Palestine struggle. They found each other through their shared human rights work here in Canada, and they are committed both to deep listening, to fighting injustices so that we can work towards peace, and to learning together. I hope that we can all do that here together tonight. Thank you.
Hillary, thank you, Hillary, for your generous introduction, and thank you, Anglican Church, for inviting us to be here today. A few weeks ago, on October 7 this year, I was standing with a group of Jews, Christians, Arabs, Muslims, right across the street from here. The name of the group is Friends of Standing Together. Now, Standing Together is a relatively new movement that was created in Israel by Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel, calling for full equality for all citizens, calling for an end to all war, an end to the attack on Gaza, return of hostages. Basically, a human rights-based group that believes that Jews and Palestinians can live together in peace and in equality. And what a novel idea. Jews and Arabs lived side by side for centuries in the Middle East and Palestine. Both Jews and Arabs are Semites. There's a lot of commonality in the language, and the way of life, and what's important, family. The problem did not always exist. It started not more than 100 years ago. And as Jeff often says, Judaism has been around for thousands of years. Zionism is a little over 100 years old. And I wanted to start with this particular subject because the more I speak with Jews, the more I speak with Zionists, the more I speak with everyone, the more I realize that this struggle is only intractable because there are those who want it to be. I normally start with telling why I wanted to write this book, so I'll do that very briefly. 17 years ago, I decided to start talking to Zionists. Palestinians normally do not talk to Zionists, and Zionists do not normally talk to Palestinians. The reason why I want to talk to Zionists is because I knew there are things that I don't know. And you learn from people who disagree with you. You don't learn from people who agree with you. And my work in human rights brought me in contact with colleagues from the Jewish community. And we started talking. Being committed to human rights, it wasn't hard for us to find common ground, despite political differences. I was in my late 40s when I heard for the first time that to Zionists, Zionism is about self-determination for the Jewish people. I had never heard that before. And my Jewish colleagues heard from me that Zionism, that everything Zionism gave Jews, it took away from Palestinians. So I became determined to continue the learning process, and to do that, I continued to talk to Zionists. And, 17 years later, it hasn't stopped. Palestinians in my community don't like it that I'm talking to Zionists, and there's a good reason for that. Because they are not ready to accept the force that destroyed Palestinian society back in 1948. That event was known as the Nakba, N-A-K-B-A, the Nakba, the destruction of Palestinian society. The word means catastrophe. Until very recently, most people in our society here had never heard the word Nakba. The Palestinian narrative was foreign to most people, while the Jewish narrative, on the other hand, was very well known. Everybody knows about the Holocaust. I'm not saying the Nakba and the Holocaust are similar events, but they are the overarching traumas for these two communities. So when the world, and in particular the West, has not recognized your catastrophe, your main trauma, you hang on to it and you refuse to accept any form that does not recognize it. So Zionism to this day does not recognize the Nakba. And that's why Palestinians don't talk to Zionists, because they feel if they talk to Zionists, then they have accepted the denial of the Nakba, accepted that their trauma, their history goes on unacknowledged. Over to you, sir. He's the Jew, by the way, in case you didn't realize that.
Really?
With a name like Wilkinson,
Thanks for the
you
reminder.
can't really tell.
So I'm also thinking, as Raja did, kind of contextualizing the moment rather than just our usual. So I've already been outed as an American, and I'm thinking about yesterday. I'm thinking that the message of our work is that winning is a shared experience. That when I win and he loses, that's not winning. And I think that what we saw again yesterday is that it appears that division is a winning strategy. That hate, anger, hostility, othering is the way to gain followers. Then I think about who won. Yes, a man won, a party won, but did the country win? Did we win? Did decency win? Did justice and righteousness and fairness win? So I think I'm thinking tonight about what barometer am I using to talk about winning. So I'm just kind of, I'll contextualize our conversation tonight around that. And to humanize that I, like a lot of us, are in, I feel like a truck ran over my chest. I mean, it's physically, it's somatic for me, like I feel it right here. So I'm present with you, that I'm not feeling quite as gregarious and joyous as I usually do, because I'm worried about where we're going. Now, bringing it back to Israel-Palestine and to Raj and I, the most important question that I think anyone can ever ask is, what don't I know? That is the moment of propelling yourself into a space that is both foreign and delicious and welcoming, if you can dip your feet in that cold water. We all know, in general, the things that we know. What we don't know is what we don't know. And that's really the obstacle to learning. Okay? If you put this circle as a pie, thinking, educated, whatever that means, person might know of all of the knowledge in the universe, might know a quarter of my fingernail. Okay? And then there's maybe a sliver about this big that we know that we don't know. The rest of it, we don't know that we don't know. We're not even conscious of it. So we haven't even made the step to wonder. Raja is very used to hearing me say that I don't want you to be willing to learn. I want you to be willing to be willing. That first little mini step is the important one. So for me, as has already been said, I was on my background is as a teacher in music, and then I did human rights work along with that for a really long time, and I was an evolved man, right? I knew about all this privilege stuff. I'd unpacked it. I'd figured out the impact of this body on the earth, I thought. And then in 2012, I arrived at a doctoral class at OISE, just about, maybe a 5-iron from here. And we were brought to an anti-Israel apartheid protest in front of the ROM right across the street. And I was with the only other Jewish classmate, and he was a little more visible. He had a kippah and talasim, out of his shirt, and we were listening to the protests and to demanding justice for Palestinians. And then somehow the crowd seemed to shift in our direction. In that moment, I questioned if I was as enlightened as I thought. All of a sudden, I was being viewed as an oppressor, not as a freedom fighter, because I was Jewish. And I went back to class. Boy, I remember this so well. I went back to class, and I shared. So graduate class is usually very small. There were maybe 14 of us. And I started sharing how uncomfortable I felt and how painful it was for me, and all this upset and anger. What was that all about? Well, it turns out about half my class was either Muslim, Arab, or Palestinian. And they looked at me and like, what the hell are you talking about? How did you feel threatened? You had all the protection in the world. They were talking about a people that live under threat. And I'm going, yeah, I know a little bit about that. And at that moment, I basically dedicated my learning and my research to finding about the story I didn't know, which led me to interview Palestinians and Jews and have them share their trauma together. And Raja was one of my victims. And I still every day, we talk pretty well every day. I really don't go through a conversation where I don't learn something, where I don't ask a naive, sometimes might be framed, stupid question. Because it's outside, because Raja's experience is outside of my experience. So I am inculcated sort of in Western ways of looking at an Eastern issue. So I'm constantly reframing that constantly turning the dial and saying, what am I missing? What am I missing? What am I missing? What am I missing? So I wanted to ask you a question. Raja mentioned the Nakba, and I was saying to someone tonight, this is an unusual crowd for us. How many people have read the book already? You'll be asked to leave if you don't raise your hand, but don't worry about it. Well, I'm sorry, could I see your hands again? How many have read the book? Okay. So of those who have read the book, before you read it, had you heard of the term Nakba? One. Okay. Is there anyone here who's heard of the Holocaust? Okay. And that's good. I'm really glad you know about the Holocaust. That's part of my family story. I'm really glad you know. But why do we have a knowledge deficit in this area? Why do we know one story and not the other? It's probably the key curiosity that I have. And when you hear people pontificate about, for instance, college campus protests, in all likelihood, they know nothing or next to nothing about the Palestinian experience. So I hope that you know that one of our key jobs is to talk about in thoughtful, open ways about the two stories, and maybe even more particularly the story you know less.
So let's go back to Zionism. I accept fully the right of the Jewish people to have safety, to live in a home where they can feel safe, both physically and being able to express who they are. None of that is objectionable or controversial to me at all. Problem is that they chose my bedroom, and I still can't go back to it. The other problem is that they blamed me that I did not accept that they chose my bedroom. And if only the Palestinians had accepted the partition agreement that was put together by essentially a bunch of Western countries at the United Nations. The United Nations was established that same year, 1948. So it's our fault that we did not accept the partition agreement, and therefore, if we had, then everything would have been fine. We would have lived in peace forever after. People say that as though it's a fact, as though it's something that they know. Of course, no one knows what would have happened the next day, the next year, 3 years later. But this is how even the most progressive of Zionists kind of try to relieve themselves of guilt, rather than, accept what they had done and come to terms with it and come to where Canada has come to, which is truth and reconciliation. Truth and reconciliation is more important than any peace deal that can be put together between Jews and Palestinians. Because to this day, most Israelis view Palestinians as lesser beings, as people who are a threat to them. They see Arabs as having replaced the Nazis. And that kind of information, again, I ask, how do you know that? When these encampments on campuses propped up earlier in the year, that Jeff mentioned them, and the reaction was that Jews on campus do not feel safe with these encampments in place. Even though, if there had been any kind of violence associated with these encampments, I haven't heard about it. But, it turns out that a sign that says Free Palestine is threatening, or could be threatening, to a Jew. And you have to ask why. Because they have been convinced that it's a binary game. That if Palestinians win, they're going to lose. It's going to be at their expense. In the past year, we've seen one side saying, you're either with us or with the terrorists. We've seen the other side say, you're either with us or with the genociders. Both of these binaries are false. And they are put there to force people to take one side against the other. And most people I know, and I'm sure you too, are neither with the terrorists or with the genociders. So it's a false question to ask in the first place. But this is the last year or plus is something that we've never seen before happen in our society because of a conflict thousands of miles away that we're not really directly involved in. But it's a good thing that we've been impacted by it the way we have, because it has waken us up to our complicity as a Western nation, as a Western society, in our double standards, in the inconsistency of how we apply our values. Someone the other day asked me, what's going to happen next? I said, I have no idea what's going to happen next. So how is this going to end? I said, I know that for this to end, we in the West must change our ways. We must see the humanity of both sides equally. That the same way we stand up with the Ukrainians in their war for freedom, we should stand with the Palestinians in their pursuit of freedom as well. It took us decades to wake up to what South Africa was doing and take a strong stand against it. I hope it wouldn't take that long for us to do the same for Palestine.
Wonderful.
I went too long, I'm sorry.
No, that was perfect.
I was inspired.
You were inspired.
It doesn't happen every day, so I thought I'll take advantage of it.
It was awesome. I find this microphone really echoey. Can you hear us okay? Awesome. So I wondered if we could pick up a little bit on this truth and reconciliation versus peace idea. Because I really want to talk a little bit about this notion of peace. The way we talk about it in places that are not here is a very sort of Western dominant way of thinking. It's that it almost assumes that we've got the market on peace, that we are more civilized, that we know sort of how to get along. I don't know if there's a lot of evidence about that, but let's just say we think we know that. And so we think that sort of things, when you hear off, the reason I'm sharing this with you is because the common narrative from the media, particularly that's risen a lot again since October 7th of last year, is the concept of a two-state solution. Does everyone know what I mean when I say two-state solution? So there would be two states alongside each other. There would be an independent Palestinian state as well as Israel as a Jewish majority state. They would have their own basic governance. There would be some shared sort of security and other issues. We don't care what solution we come up with that stops the violence. So if it's a two-state solution as a starter, we're good with that. But the key part to understand is that the two-state solution is part of the Western mindset of thinking that we can fix a problem that is not ours to fix. It creates a solution to make it easier for us to do our business. You know, to have oil shipping, to have a military compound. The two-state solution has never been about being sure that Palestinians have the same rights that I have as a Jew. Does anyone know how hard it would be today for me to become an Israeli citizen? Anyone have any idea? Like the hoops, all the visas I'd have to apply for, and the years of waiting for a green card, and nope. Arrive at the airport in Tel Aviv and said, here I am. Great, welcome. You're now an Israeli citizen. Just like that. Why? Because I'm Jewish. Raja, in many parts, would need a permit to see a relative. Not to live there, to visit. So these core inequities is what we mean when we talk about truth and reconciliation rather than peace. We have to begin by saying there are wrongs that have been done, and that I, as a Jew, am comfortable, even eager, to speak to my brother and say, I am sorry for my role in that wrong. Because I don't feel the safety and freedom that Israel provides in my heart because it was done on his back. That's not freedom. Right? So if we go back to my beginning conversation about the guy in the States and so on, is that that's a misdefinition of freedom. That because I can throw my weight around and get something, that makes me free. No, what makes me free is the assurance that rights are at the center of our moral compass. Not my rights or his rights, but our rights. Because I'm in a church, I'll say this, Bishop, I hope I do this okay. Sometimes we are asked from Christian audiences, well, what should I do, as a Christian? Like, what's my role? And I have a simplistic, naive answer. Ask yourself what Jesus would do. Get that answer, and you're good to go. Because I'm separating our faith traditions from our moral traditions, from what it means to do right, what it means to take the lump out of our eye before working on the speck on somebody else's. Because to me, that's what faith is the ability to see all of my fellow walkers of the earth as my brothers and sisters. That's what faith is to me. So the example of that, which I, as a Jew, see in Jesus, is the great way to think about Jews and Palestinians. Who has power? Who's misusing the power? Who needs a leg up? Who needs support? Who needs help? Who needs justice? And follow that lens. Not who's right, but what's just.
I got to like Judaism because of this guy.
Is it that hard?
I mean, the idea of tikkun olam, repairing the world, healing the world. How lovely is that? I can subscribe to that. Not much happening in Gaza these days that is repairing the world. You have to look for tikkun or the olam under the rubble. The sanctity of every human life, that's a core Jewish value. Israel is not living by these values. It just isn't.
Are you still inspired?
Pardon?
You're still inspiring?
Yeah.
Okay, keep going.
So I take a very strong stand against anti-Semitism. Jew hatred is utterly unacceptable to me. Some people have chosen to weaponize anti-Semitism to silence criticism of Israel. My entire life, I've witnessed how any pro-Palestinian narrative would either be described as supporting terrorists or anti-Semitism. We spend, for those of you who read the book, know that we spend a good chunk of it explaining the two narratives. So I'd like to share with you now some of that, the two narratives around anti-Semitism.
You know, that's exactly where I was going.
Of course, that's who we're going.
We're doing this too long. We're finishing each other's sentences.
He arrived at the same place that I arrived at through my human rights work. He arrived to it through his Judaism. So, what's there not to like?
Because I'm just going to do something really quick, because I saw a few people hadn't read the book, and I was totally teasing you. I want to make sure that we're working on a relatively equal knowledge base. So when we say the Nakba, do you know what we're referring to? Is there anyone who's not sure what we're referring to? It's okay if you say, I'm not sure. Good. Thank you so much for saying that. So in 1948, what is now celebrated as the Day of Israel Independence, the forming of the country, in order for that to happen, there was a war that was fought in two phases, a guerrilla sort of civil war, and then a war where 5 Arab countries joined the conflict. At the end of this, as a cause of this, about 750,000 Palestinians who lived in the land between the river and the sea had to leave. Some left voluntarily, most were forced out. The most important part is they were never allowed to return. 400 to 500 Arab villages were destroyed permanently.
So that people won't return.
So that they would not return. So the term Nakba means catastrophe in Arabic, and it is the catastrophe of the Palestinian people who lost their homes, their identities, their cultures, and were sent off as refugees to various other countries where almost ubiquitously they were not welcomed. If you understand the Jewish experience, very, very, very similar to our very long history of nomadic displacement. Okay? A lot more in common with our stories than are different. So that's what we mean by the Nakba. And the two sort of meta-narratives we talk about are the Holocaust and the Nakba, these two sort of deep traumas that keep us in our pain and our silos. We're not comparing the two, as Raja said earlier. We're just saying these are the big T traumas that work to keep our communities separate. Okay? The key part that's harder to understand here in Canada is the Nakba might be considered an event of 1948. For Palestinians, the Nakba continues today. It is reminded of in every daily experience of oppression, loss of land, loss of housing, loss of freedom, killing. So it's never ended. 76 years later, it has continued. And even though the Holocaust in many ways continues emotionally in the Jewish spirit, it doesn't continue physically. It's really important to kind of get that. Okay, sorry for that long detour. Okay, so we're going to read a little tiny part about the word anti-Semitism, which has taken up a lot of conversation over the last while. To a Jew, anti-Semitism is a past trauma, a present trauma, and an almost guaranteed future trauma. Anti-Semitism is a thread that runs through the tapestry of Jewish life. It is ever present, foreboding, and certain. It weaves its way, often surreptitiously and silently, through even the happiest of times. It is the monster whose haunting presence breathes down one's neck, refusing to allow any Jew to forget its existence.
To a Palestinian, anti-Semitism is a muzzle, a weapon to silence, defend, and deflect from or otherwise discredit critics of Israel's actions. It is a club to clobber the heads of those taking a stand for Palestine, and the shackle that ties down the hands of solidarity. It is the boot that presses down one's neck, choking speech, silencing thought, removing voice, and eliminating hope. It's an occupation of the narrative. Anti-Semitism is this powerful force that, in effect, ends up oppressing both Jews and Palestinians.
Just for a second, we're going to read one little more bit, but we're going to contextualize how symbols can have changing in multiple experiences for groups. The Star of David, the Mogen David, a symbol once used to oppress Jews. You know, when the Holocaust Jews were made to wear the yellow star, is now not only a ubiquitous representative symbol of the Jewish people and the Jewish state, it is also emblazoned on Israeli tanks and the wings of fighter jets that bomb Palestinians. Freedom for one, oppression for another. So the reason we do that one particularly is to show how different something that you might think we all have an agreed upon experience of lands. So we're not talking about the definition of anti-Semitism. We're talking about the impact. So for most in my community, anti-Semitism is a permanent threat. It is the past, relived in the present, promised in the future. It guides decision-making. It creates fear-based decision-making. It leads to traumatic strangulation of moral integrity because it brings us inward, not outward. Has us think in here, not out there. And as you heard from the passage Raja read, it's a completely different experience for Palestinians. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's been historically been used to silence and discredit the Palestinian narrative. More recently, in the last 20 years, some folks decided that there is a new kind of anti-Semitism, and that is anti-Zionism. So if you are against Zionism, then you are a Jew hater. That's clearly a very, political stance there. Zionism is essentially, a political movement. Yes, for Jewish self-determination, but it doesn't end there. If you want to look at Zionism only as a movement for self-determination, and you're against that, then I can see how, you can interpret that as not wanting for Jews what other peoples get to have. But Zionism does not end there. It doesn't end on that with that definition. Zionism is a country with a government, with nuclear weapons, with one of the most advanced armies in the world, supported by the United States, oppressing and other people. This is the outcome of Zionism today. So, as a Palestinian, clearly, I cannot be for Zionism the way it has manifested itself. As much as I want for Jews to have a safe home, Zionism has gone way beyond that. So, that sense of conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism is only done for political purposes, and it's confusing the issue, and in my view, it is hurting the fight against real anti-Semitism.
That's why anti-Semitism ends up oppressing both Jews and Palestinians.
That's exactly right. The point. Now, we talked about trauma a lot in this book. Actually, the main contribution of this book to the discourse on Israel-Palestine is that it brings in the trauma angle. And that's thanks to Dr. Trauma here. On a good day, I call him Dr. Trauma. The trauma angle is very important, and I'll give you a small illustration of that. When October 7 happened, the reaction of Jewish communities everywhere was astronomical. I was looking at it and thinking, sure, 1,200 people were killed, this is huge. But then I realized that to Jews, these weren't 1,200 Israelis that were killed, these were 1,200 Jews. It's another attack on Jews. Trauma kicks in, Holocaust happening again. Of course, it wasn't a Holocaust in terms of magnitude, but the feeling of the Holocaust came back. Jews are being killed in large numbers. Now, to Palestinians, of course, seeing the people of Gaza carrying their belongings on their backs, going from one unsafe place to another unsafe place. These images that we see in color on our phones these days remind me of grainy black and white photographs of the Nakba of 1948, the exodus of Palestinians from Palestine, and making them from a society that was prosperous to a group of refugees scattered all over the countries in the region, and practically eventually all over the world. Which is, of course, yet another parallel with Jewish history.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's always tons we can share, but it's about 8 o'clock. Why don't we take our break? Because particularly in this small group, we have lots of time for questions, and we'd like to dive into the questions really deeply, because then we know really what you would like support with. Okay? So how long is our break? 10 minutes. Okay.
Very good.
Maybe you can turn the mic off so I don't say it.
That's on. Okay. We are going to resume with the Q&A component of the evening. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Jeff Nowers. I'm one of the co-coordinators of Interfaith ministry here in the Diocese of Toronto. And we have quite a number of questions that have been submitted on handwritten cards here, as well as some online, and we're going to try to get to as many as we can. We're going to lead off with this question, and perhaps both of you could speak to this. This person says, "To my understanding, the Palestinians have been offered their own state 5 times. Why have they never accepted any of the offers?"
Do you mind if I start as the Jew with it? Because you're going to have the bigger answer.
Go for it.
Okay, so I'm going to try an analogy. Okay? This lovely woman here, I'm going to come, I'm going to take your house. Okay? It's now mine. I'm kicking you out. You can't come back. Now, because there's a lot of strife between us, I'm going to offer you the smallest upstairs bedroom. You can have that back, and then we'll be at peace. Would that be okay with you? Okay. That's kind of the first understanding of what the challenge is with the Palestinians were offered. So for a Palestinian, the land between the river and the sea was their homeland for hundreds of years. And any form of solution or state is always a small portion, and in all Israel prime ministers telling, it is words like not a real state or a kind of a state. So Raj is going to have even more articulate answers, but I think the key part to start with, when we find ourselves asking a question about why didn't they, I think we need to question right there and stop and say, wait a minute, what if I don't know much about they? What if I've heard this talking point, but I don't know what's behind it? So if we want to understand, we take a step back and we say, what is behind this statement that the Palestinians were offered repeatedly a state of their own, but they kept refusing it? Is there parts of that story that I don't know? What is the history of the two-state solution? Where did it come from?
Yeah, I mean, you've given a very good answer there. I'll only add to it that each one of these peace deals were brokered by a dishonest broker, the United States. The United States is not a disinterested party. It's not it's not entering this with no vested interest. Israel is America's key ally in the Middle East. Think of it as a forward base for the United States and the Middle East. For decades, money has been flowing, support for Israel from the United States in the billions every year. Arms. When a dishonest broker brokers a deal, the deal is dishonest. That's the bottom line. If the Palestinians had actually been given a state that was sufficient for them to be independent and have sovereignty over and decision-making over their lives, they would have taken it. Even Rabin himself said, it's not a real state that we're offering. So there is propaganda, there is disinformation out there, and whenever that information that you hear is meant to demonize someone or dismiss someone or dehumanize someone, look at it again. That part of the narrative does not help us go anywhere constructive. We need to know each other's narratives, but without the propaganda, without the disinformation.
Yeah, the one thing I would add, maybe we can, just for a moment, add a Canadian context to it. So it would be similar to saying, we've done all kinds of lovely treaty offers to Indigenous people. Why don't they just happily accept them? Right? Maybe that's an easier framework for us sitting in Canada to think about it, because I think most of us are more well-versed in what Canada has done to Indigenous people. So when we hear something like that, we go, wait a minute, that doesn't pass the smell test. So maybe that's kind of an access to us that will help us.
What else you got?
Okay, let's move on to the next question here. This is submitted online. How do we have meaningful, honest, factual discourse now that the IHRA, that's the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which equates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, how do we have meaningful discourse if this has now been accepted by the Canadian federal government, this definition of anti-Semitism?
Yeah, see, earlier I was talking about the weaponization of anti-Semitism. IHRA does exactly that, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. It really confuses Israel with Judaism and anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and intentionally so that, people who don't want to be accused of being anti-Semitic are going to have to, cautiously look at every word they say about Israel so that they're not accused of being anti-Semitic. So they'd probably rather not say anything about Israel, in the end. This is part of our complicity as a Western nation, that we are, putting our thumb on the scale in support of one narrative and against another. Many Jewish intellectuals have written and spoken out against the IHRA definition. All civil liberties folks have spoken out against it. Human rights organizations have done the same thing. But that was a political decision, taken by our government. And, if it actually becomes, they say it's not legally binding, but it looks like it's going to be socially binding. And that's a big problem, and that's something we have to push back against. There's no other solution, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's, as the question was being read, I was feeling inside, well, please let us know when you figure out a good way to have honest discourse around IHRA. But I think the key part I would offer you is that there is occasion where somebody is both anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. And when that happens, focus on their anti-Semitism. Separate the politics and say what you were doing. If you hear, a phrase like Jews go back to Poland, and that's sending Jews, theoretically at least, to their death, that's anti-Semitic. There's no questions about it. But in general discourse and conversations, keep anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in two separate pots. That's the best way to avoid it. Okay? So discussions of the state of Israel, even somebody, for example, who only decides to work on justice with Israel. So they ignore what China does, they ignore what Iran does, they ignore what other bad actors do. It doesn't make them anti-Semitic. That's one of the claims of IHRA. If you focus more on Israel than other places, then you're anti-Semitic. No, it means this is the issue that you've chosen to be passionate about. If I'm passionate about Indigenous rights in Canada. That doesn't mean I don't, that I have no concern for the Uyghurs in China. It just means this is where I'm putting my energy. So I just think it's really, really important to keep those two in separate pots. You're going to be much safer. If you think the criticism of Israel is unfair, make a good argument. That's totally fine. But don't try to defeat that criticism by calling it anti-Semitic. That's demeaning to me as a Jew. That's saying that I am such a victim that you can't talk about a country that I might have political feelings about without targeting my identity. It's like if I criticize, a politician in Canada, I'm anti-Canadian. I mean, that's crazy talk. So let's really try to keep those two things apart.
One of the examples given in the definition of anti-Semitism is calling Israel a racist state. Well, why can't I call Israel a racist state? How is that Jew hatred? The Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem is an Israeli human rights organization. They all identified the political system in Israel as apartheid. That's racism. Are they all anti-Semitic? That's nonsense.
All right. We have a couple of questions about your book. This question has to do with the subtitle of the book. What Jews and Palestinians don't want to know about each other. Is it useful to use the terms Jew and Palestinian, one referring to a religion, the other a nation? Aren't both sides Semites? Is there a way to create a bridge through language?
Wonderful. I guess that's mine. Okay, it's a really great question. We get, sort of varieties of this question because it was really interesting. Like choosing titles is very interesting in a book, and it's usually in part chosen by your publisher. So the way we're framing this is not an antithetical relationship between a Jew and a Palestinian, because you're right, we are both Semitic tribes. It is saying that the experience of being a Jew and the experience of being Palestinian have been held entirely separately. We don't talk to each other, we don't learn from each other, we don't in many ways even like or trust each other. So the goal is to say that these are two Canadian communities that are cherished, well-recognized, large contributors to society in many, many ways that have no sort of intersection with each other. And some people will say to us sometimes, well, why didn't you say why Zionists and Palestinians don't talk to each other? And the reason is because being a Jew in Canada, the US, in the plethora of opinion, is to be identifying yourself in some form as a supporter of Zionism or as a Zionist. Means totally different things to different people. So it's really important not to sort of lump this coal all together. It is also important to note that to Palestinians, it's a Zionist is a Zionist pretty much because of what we're supporting and the harm that support causes. But I think it's really, really, it's a challenge that I wish that we would do better in, is that we rightly are upset when somebody blames a Jew in Canada for the actions of the Israeli government. That's not right. That's not fair. You should never do that. Yet I've had to challenge myself in my own community because we seem to have difficulty separating Judaism from Israel. So why are we expecting this other group to do it when we really haven't been able to do it very well ourselves?
Let's move on to this question. In your book, you explore the theme of division, physically, emotionally, culturally. How do you want readers to be thinking about the role of walls in influencing human relationships and society?
Wow.
Great question.
We agreed you'll do the difficult ones, right?
I figured as soon as he started reading, I'm good, it's his turn.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I don't think we've had before.
No.
But it makes a lot of sense. I mean, the wall is part of the title of the book. The first wall I saw was in Cyprus. Cyprus is a small island in the Mediterranean, just off the coast of Lebanon. I remember being in Nicosia, the capital. Cyprus had a struggle between its Greek part and its Turkish part. And the last war they had was in the 70s, there was an armistice and a wall was built that divides the island. I was young when I was there. I was, visiting from Lebanon, and I remember seeing this old man standing by the wall and looking at it. And I talked to him in English. Cyprus used to be a colony of Great Britain, so most people spoke English well. And he said, I come here every day. My house is on the other side. I can't go there. And I remember when there was no wall and we were neighbors and friends with everybody. The walls are meant to separate people, keep them apart, away from each other. The wall that was built in Israel, mostly on Palestinian land, supposedly for security reasons to keep the terrorists out, did exactly that. It separated Jews from Palestinians. Before the wall was built, there was a lot more back and forth between the two sides. Jews will often go and buy their groceries from the Palestinian side because they're cheaper. Will go get their cars fixed on the Palestinian side because it's cheaper. And that built, relations between people who would talk to each other on daily things. Today, the only Jew that a Palestinian will see is a soldier on a checkpoint. This Rosanna Canada that Hillary mentioned when she introduced us, its purpose is to create human contact between the two sides through medicine, so that there are other opportunities for the two sides to get to know each other than on a checkpoint when an 18-year-old carrying a machine gun into your window. Some people say, well, that wall succeeded in preventing terrorism. Others would say what prevented terrorism was a security agreement between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government. Regardless, the wall is ugly, and if Palestinians or Jews were to share the land one day, there cannot be a wall. I'll leave part two of the question to you about the psychological walls. That's up your alley.
Okay. I think it was a really profound question. I really appreciated the thoughtfulness of the question. A wall, psychologically, is a protection mechanism. It goes back to our base instinct of flight or fright, of seeing new information as dangerous, as encountering something that might challenge our perception. There's an old saying about good fences make good neighbors. Good fences ensure that you're not neighbors, right? Because if being a neighbor is to care about each other, to know about each other, to learn about each other, that barrier prevents you from knowing. So the first thing I think I really want to comfort us with, in a sense, is that the construction of walls is a very natural social cycle phenomenon that we do in society all the time to protect ourselves, to keep us safe. We talk a lot in places like churches and other centers, the term community. Don't know if we've really looked deeply enough to see that there is a beauty in community, but the community is also a form of othering. When you select a community, you place another group outside of that community. You metaphorically create a wall around your community that allows you to free rein, to kind of have your own values and not be penetrated by others' experience. So the wall is really a protection from our shared humanity. And it's normal, but I think all of us who have dismantled a wall, who've deconstructed a wall, can tell stories of being richer and fuller because we did that. The wall that could have, maybe did for a little bit, but could have existed between us, has allowed this brotherhood friendship to appear. Because we relate through shared values, not through an experience of othering or difference.
Moderators aren't typically supposed to hijack the questions,
Okay.
but I have a question that I'd like to pose to
Sure.
both of you. Your book was written before October the 7th, 2023. In fact, it was published just before
4 days before.
4 days before that event. To what extent would the book look any different if you were writing it right now?
We will have more examples to demonstrate what we said in the book the first time around. The way the two communities have reacted to each other, to every word being said, to the positions taken by politicians and leaders have, demonstrated this clear divide of the narratives. One thing I would probably be writing more about is the idea of settler colonialism, which we heard a lot about in the past year. And we do talk about it in the book, if I'm not mistaken, but I think there's more to it these days than was back then. Now, the left in Canada and North America in general, in the last number of years, started taking up the Palestinian cause as a human rights and justice cause that they wanted to support the same way they supported Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Idle No More, all these kinds of justice movements. And that's been a sort of a double-edged thing for our society. On the one hand, it has helped to mainstream the Palestinian narrative. It helped to, take that narrative from out there and bring it here for us, for everybody to hear and try to understand. The downside of it is that, the left has its loonies and it has its sort of radical left who ideologically look at things and can't see beyond the ideology. So they looked at, Israel as a settler colonial project, therefore it's bad, therefore go back to Poland. Now, Israel has a settler colonial element to it in the sense that back then when Zionism came on the scene in the late 19th century, colonialism was the way to do business. It wasn't a dirty word the way it is today. So Zionism was inspired by colonialism as a political vehicle that will allow the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine where someone else lived, because it was acceptable back then. But Zionism really succeeded because of the Holocaust. The numbers of Jews that ended up coming to Palestine were increased sharply during the Second World War and the Holocaust, and after it, when Europe did not want to keep the Jews that were still there. No one wanted them. Canada didn't want them. The United States didn't want them. They went to Palestine. That's where the numbers grew. And now, I cannot look at those folks escaping Nazis as settler colonials. These were people who were looking for a safe haven. So in that sense, it's not settler colonial. But the concept of Zionism originally did borrow from colonial thinking. Now, the last thing I will add here is that to Palestinians, the impact of Zionism is exactly the same as the impact of every other colonial movement in history. The dispossession, the loss of self, the loss of identity, the destruction of a culture, and so on.
Beautiful. The only thing I'll add is this. There's been a major misconception, I think, about October 7th. As horrible as it was, particularly for my community. October 7th didn't create the rift between Jews and Palestinians. It exposed it. And I think that's really, really, really central to how we shift our thinking. There's a place we're working with recently who is having friction, and apparently the friction was caused because a subset of this group suggested that October 7th happened within a context. And the person who said this to me, they said, they used the C word. And I of course, I'm aware as a Jew how that word context has been very upsetting for many in my community, because it is read as an excuse. But it's not that at all. It's saying that this struggle has been going on for 76 years. This is not a new phenomenon. And October 7th is a major moment in it, but it's one of many, 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 many moments. And I think it's really, really important to remember that, because we've essentialized October 7th as if it's completely out of step with anything else that's ever happened. It's not. I mean, this is the 5th Gaza war since the blockade in 2006. The 5th. It's the worst, but it's not new.
Why doesn't Israel simply cede territory to Palestine, to Palestinians?
Good question.
Can I answer it in a subversive way? Would that be all right with you?
What do you like?
Good. So that we're really clear, because I'm sure sometimes sounds that we're promoting the Palestinian side of things, and in one way we are, because it's less known and because we are focused on a real deep sort of injustice. But I want to be absolutely clear so you don't misunderstand anything that we're saying. 2 national projects landed in a hunk of land about the size of the state of Vermont. And the solution is for those 2 people to figure out a way to share that land peacefully. That's it. I know that sounds overly simple, but the reason that it's so important to understand it that way is because it's not primarily a contest over religion. It has a religious element, more so since Hamas has come to power, but it's not the prime element. The growth in Israel of the Haredi and ultra-Orthodox have also created a more religious element, but at its core, it's a competition over land and over the narrative about that land. So I think the best way to sort of frame that question is why don't Israel does this or why doesn't Palestine do this? It's because there has not been the will to work it out. And as far as, in our view, Israel's role, which we've said several times already tonight, is in many ways propped up by Western interests. So there's no incentive for Israel to do it differently. You saw that when October 7th happened, every single Western country said we support Israel absolutely unequivocally. Basically, we gave them a free pass. Do whatever you want. This was such a horrible event, you just go for it. That is completely antithetical to our supposed stated Western values. So I think the core piece is to really get that its willingness, and as I think we said in the beginning, its recognition by Israel and the larger Jewish world that we have done harm and that we need to look into the eyes, of our fellow Semites and say, we're sorry. This was, we were in a really bad place and we needed help, but what we did to you was not right. And what we've done to you since is not right. And until there's, about human nature, right? It changes when it must. When the pain of staying still is worse than the pain of moving. That pain has not happened yet.
With the intention of creating a Jewish majority state, Zionism from day one and until this minute has wanted to keep as much of the land as possible with as little of the people as possible. As Jeff said, it's not a big piece of land. But there's room for everybody in it once they actually decide to share it equally.
2 more questions, and then I think we will wrap it up for the evening.
Sounds good.
Okay. This is a question that perhaps begs some factual clarification about the events that have led up to 1948. If the Arab countries had not declared war on Israel, would the Palestinians not have been expelled?
The expulsion of the Palestinians started long before the Arab armies joined the fight. There's historical evidence of this by Israeli historians. The expulsion of the Palestinians was necessary to create a Jewish majority state. There were many more Palestinians than Jews back then. And it was necessary to remove them to create this Jewish state. And I'd like to also add here the Balfour Declaration. Familiar with the Balfour Declaration? Some people are. Lord Balfour was the Foreign Affairs Secretary of Great Britain. Great Britain was the superpower in early 1900s. Britain was at war with Germany and its allies, which included the Ottomans, the Ottoman Empire, and the First World War. The Zionist movement had approached Great Britain to get its support for the establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine. And in 1917, Lord Balfour issued a statement, today infamously known as the Balfour Declaration. That statement said that His Majesty's government favors the creation of a Jewish home in Palestine. This is when, the Jewish presence in Palestine became politicized. It wasn't just Jews and Arabs living in that land. There was a political statement from the superpower of the day that said that this presence is going to become a political presence. And that's when Palestinians started paying attention that, the immigration of Jews from Europe after the pogroms in Eastern Europe, for instance, that started then, that this is not just people looking for safety, these are people there's an intention to build a state here, where we are, for them. And this is when the resistance to the idea of Zionism started among Palestinians. And 2 years later, Great Britain replaced the Ottomans in Palestine. It had a mandate letter from the League of Nations at the time that essentially ordered the Great Britain to facilitate the immigration of Jews to Palestine and the establishment of a home for them. So, as this started way before the Arab armies joined the fight.
I think it's can be very helpful if you're interested in going deeper at reading some books about the history of Zionism. Zionism evolved as a movement. It really started in 1892, led by a man named Theodor Herzl. Some of you may have heard of. He was actually a journalist. At the time, he was working in France, and there was a viciously anti-Semitic incident called the Dreyfus Affair, where a colonel in the French army who was Jewish was accused of conspiracy. Even though it was proven false, he was still tried and convicted, overturned, convicted again, and then overturned. And it led Herzl and his colleagues and friends, he was a Swiss businessman, to really say, we're not ever going to be safe here in Europe. We need to do something. And his vision, as best as it's been articulated, was more of what you might consider a homeland. So a safe place. There was an awareness, there was people there. There were many that talked about it as a shared experience. But there's two things to understand. One is these were European white men. Their only experience of expansionism that they were familiar with was European settler colonialism. They didn't copy it out of viciousness, I don't believe, but because it was the example that they knew. The other part is that in the early 1920s, when things started to become more violent, a different kind of leader grew out called Zeb Jabotinsky. He really recognized as early as 1920 that it was going to be us or them. So this sort of notion that everything would have worked out if the Palestinians had behaved differently really doesn't work out in the facts. Because the Zionists had made a pretty clear choice that, to understand that the Palestinians weren't going to accept this change easily. So there actually was even a military plan. It's easy to read about. It's called Plan Dalit, where there was very clearly laid out expectations of how Arab Palestinians need to be moved out in order to create space for Jews and to ensure that there was a Jewish majority. none of this is to absolve a Palestinian leadership or others of gross misconduct and mistakes that they made and continue to make. So we're never like making some pie in the sky idea that we got, all good guys over here and all bad guys over here. It's never that simple. But I really would encourage you to push back anytime you hear a simplistic notion. If this hadn't happened, it would have been fine, right? Not likely. Last question?
Yep. We're gonna end with this question, and my apologies to those who submitted questions, and we didn't get to every question, but I know Jeff and Raja are going to be around for a little bit after we conclude, and perhaps you can pose whatever questions you'd like to them at that time. Here's the final question. In hope of just inserting the tiniest crack of daylight into the situation, where perhaps understanding could begin to grow, how would you suggest starting in a way that is non-threatening and does not re-engage the trauma or anger of the Jewish community? How could we inject all of our members, and by members I think this person's referring to members of the Anglican Church, all of our members with just a seed of knowledge or willingness to be willing to learn?
Well, actually, today we got to answer more questions than most times, and so the organizer did a good thing, giving us ample time to have the Q&A. Why don't you get us started on this one?
Okay. So if you have read the book already, you know that we have sort of 3 pathways to change. I don't want to give them away. But I'll start with the first one. It's called From Many to One. It's building one human relationship, one bridge to another human at a time. I didn't enter my deeper relationship with Raja as a Jew to a Palestinian, but as 2 men who like hummus and an occasional
My hummus.
beverage, especially his hummus. There's commonality all around us. It's not that hard to find it. And the concept of many to one is to reduce tragedies and traumas. The questioner referred to not triggering trauma. When you have a giant concept like 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust or 750,000 displaced Palestinians, our brain has no space for it. We don't know how to do it. So imagine one story. Be with that one story. Learn that one story. And then multiply that story over and over and over and over and over again. That's how we build alliances and community.
As I mentioned earlier, I've been dialoguing for 17 years. And the only dialogue that actually gets us places is the honest dialogue. The difference between dialogue and debate is that debate means you're in it to prove the other side wrong. Dialogue is about understanding the other. And hopefully through understanding each other, you'll able to find some common ground. The most important point in dialogue is trusting that the other person is telling you what they genuinely feel, what they eventually think, and are not just using, propaganda or tropes or something to prove they're right and you're wrong. It can take years to get there. It can take hours to get there, depending on how honest the person is able to be with themselves and with the other. It took us minutes, literally minutes, because we both approach the subject with professional integrity, intellectual integrity, and honesty. I criticize Palestinians all the time, and many Jews criticize Israel and Jews all the time. This is where we need to start. I sit with him, and the first thing I'll do is I'll criticize my side and invite him to do the same. You know, we've been trying to prove each other wrong for way too long.
We heard, as very common, a couple of questions tonight about, things like, if the Palestinians had done this, what would have happened? And I just want to make sure whoever asks those questions, those are perfectly fine questions. We understand them. I think what we encourage all of us to do is when someone says something, start with, where'd you learn that? How do you know that? You're not threatening them. You're not saying they're wrong. You're asking them to take a minute to think about. So if somebody read that, there's been all these offers of a state and the Palestinians refused that, okay, where'd you read that? Have you read any contrary information about that? Do you know the content of those offers? Do you know the political, environment at the time? The key figure in a lot of it was Yasser Arafat. Do you know who he is? Do you know what his pluses and minuses were? Do you know what his difficulty was with his community? If he'd accepted the key agreement after Camp David, it would have been executed on the spot the same day, because his people were not there. It's not where they were. So as a leader, you have to follow your people. So complicate things. Don't let them be simple. Complicate them. This is not easy territory.
Today I'm going to let you have the last word, so there you go.
What day is it? Can I write this down in the calendar somewhere?
It's 9 o'clock, that's why. Thank you folks for listening to us.
Just as
for
you
inviting
come
us.
up, just to mention, we did bring some books. They do make kind of great holiday presents. And we're happy to sign the book you've already have if you'd like us to. That would be fine. Okay.
Thank you for your candor and your responses to all these questions. I'm going to turn it over to Julie for some concluding remarks.
My goodness, what a rich and challenging evening this has been, and how wonderful it's been to have you, Jeffrey, and Raja come and speak with us as friends. Especially that offers us such a hopeful vision. There's so much in what you said tonight for us to take away. It's been very engaging and thought-provoking. The last few comments made me think about an iceberg, how you said that you only see the surface so much, or we're only given surface information and simplistic statements, and how it's very incumbent upon us to dig deep and to see what's underneath those statements. So many things sort of struck me, and I appreciate it also in terms of understanding your use of analogies, with the house and moving into the house and things like that. I think that helps me, anyways, to understand on a sort of personal level what you're talking about. I took a lot of notes here. To recognize that we don't know what we don't know, right? And to be willing to learn. The importance of being aware of false binaries, and of course, and I want to thank you too, because you've really created like a safe space for us to ask these questions. Because I think for a lot of us, we just don't really know where to start. right? And so this has been really helpful on so many levels, understanding, knowledge, and also in a practical way as well. And finally, I just want to say that you made a statement about faith, both of you, and said about faith is seeing everyone as brothers and sisters, and seeing, understanding and recognizing the sanctity of every human life. So we'll say amen to that. And we thank you for offering us such a hopeful vision. And we hope that all of us can be a small part of that vision in our own communities, wherever we may be. So thank you very much. And I just wanted to have a shout out to Hillary for bringing the sweets and the snacks, which come from a Middle Eastern bakery here in the city. Awesome. So thank you, Hillary, for those. And thank you, everyone, for coming this evening. Thank you
so much. Thank you, Jeff.